This is Talk Radio.
Keeping you up to date across the UK. Online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
Patrick Christys on Talk Radio.
Evening all, it's Patrick Christys here on Talk. Right now, there's loads of you that we want calling in, okay, because we've got this issue, the climate crisis issue. Is it actually all just a front so that we can all kind of smash the political system as we know it, reinvigorate something like anarchy or radical luxury communism? That seems to be the message coming from the Extinction Rebellion chap that we had on before. Isn't it absolutely outrageous that the government is yet again doing the old do as I say, not as I do issue, right? This raises its head so many times. The whole healthy eating thing. What do you think Boris Johnson has for dinner every single night? Pretty sure if you cut him open, you just found a wheel of cheese and some rioja, right? This guy's not eating healthily, is he? They're talking about, you need now to fork out and get yourself a new electric car. All right, okay, fine. Is the climate change spokeswoman doing it? No, she drives a diesel, doesn't she? Of course, because it's more fun driving diesel, right? Just because you drive a diesel doesn't mean you want to club a seal to death. It's just the fact that it feels nice and I actually quite like the smell. There, I said it, okay? What do you think about all this? Will you be radically changing your life to fight the big climate crisis? 03444 991000. I want to hear from you. I also want to hear from you on what was our main topic of the day, right, which is the fact that can jihadis ever be de-radicalised, or can terrorists ever really be de-radicalised? We're hearing the inquest now into the death of Sudash Aman, who was shot to death on the streets of Streatham after stabbing two people. He pledged allegiance to the caliphate. He was in prison for no less than 13 terror offences. He was allowed out of prison under 24-hour surveillance, and all he did was go and steal a knife and then stab two people. Right, this is ridiculous, okay? He was even seen buying the components for a fake suicide vest. We didn't nick him. All of these things. He was revealed to have asked his girlfriend if she could buy him a machete. We didn't nick him. And then we end up with a Fishmongers Hall terror attacker, don't we? Who convinced everyone he'd been de-radicalised, despite the fact that we had to watch him because of his known aspirations to commit a terror attack. How do those things marry up? Can anyone ever be de-radicalised? 03444 991000 is that number. I want to hear from you. We're going to go to the phones throughout the show, so get yourself on the airwaves, people. But look, now in fact we're going to talk about our big political panel with Joseph Silke, Communications Officer at Bright Blue, and Richard Power Said, former Labour advisor. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us on what is going to be a bumper political panel, no doubt. Let's start with this de-radicalisation issue, if that's okay. And Richard, I'm going to start with you. Do you believe that terrorists could ever be de-radicalised?
Well, I mean, obviously, some people have been. So I think it's not a question of, like, can it ever happen? It's a question of, like, what has gone wrong in these absolutely appalling situations. I mean, I think what you've described there was, like, terrible failures of policing as much as anything else in those situations. I mean, are we surprised that our police make mistakes when they've been incredibly underfunded? There are some terrible people out there who we need to be protected by. It sounds like these guys shouldn't have been out of prison, but that's not really the same thing as can people be de-radicalised.
I think the issue that I would have is, Richard, just sticking with you on this for now, is you can never really tell, is the thing, is if someone has been. I understand that, okay, let's assume that some people can, right? You never really know. And is it ever worth taking the risk? Once someone has been convicted of something like, joining a caliphate and trying to fly out to Syria to fight for them, or trying to commission an act of terror in this country and getting relatively far along with that process. So, signed up, card-carrying jihadi, right? Do we ever really know when that's stopped? And do we need to take the risk? Shouldn't we just lock them up?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things there to deal with. I mean, one is it's really important to remember that pretty much everyone who we're talking about here is, like, very, very unhappy, very traumatized, very mad people. It's not so much a question of, like, do they still have this ideological affiliation? It's like, are they still psychotic? So that's the kind of the first thing, that's the thing that makes them, like, particularly dangerous. Secondly, that there are lots of people, unfortunately not lots of people, there's a significant chunk of people who have made this, like, absolutely terrible decision to go fight in another country in a war. They subscribe to a really disgusting ideology. That is not the same thing. We need to be really clear that not all of those people are a danger to people on the streets in the UK. There's very, very different kinds of things going on there.
What, if someone who's gone to fight for ISIS abroad is not a danger to people on the streets of the UK?
No, that's not what I said.
No.
I said that they're not necessarily, and that there's a really big difference there. All of the people, as far as I'm aware, who've committed atrocities on the streets of the UK have been very clearly really mad, very unhappy, very unstable people, very often people who got involved with a particular ideology, in this case extremist Islamism, very recently before they became violent.
Okay, just very lastly before I go over to Joseph, sorry to Joseph to keep you online. Just out of interest, Richard, if someone has gone and fought for the caliphate in Syria or wherever, right, and they've come back to the UK, would you let them live with you?
That's not the question, is it? Right.
Well, it depends whether or not, do they pose a danger. It's like, do you want them around at your gaff?
No, that's not. No. That's not the question, Patrick. The point is that there is a crime that they have committed, and they get sentenced for that crime, and then they should be in jail for the period of that sentence, or until we are absolutely certain that they're safe. And what I'm really worried about is that a lot of this conversation seems to be almost along the lines of, well, should we just throw them in jail and throw away the key? Okay, but the point is, Patrick, that for the last year and a half, you've been talking about how our civil liberties are being undermined by COVID regulations. And you're right, they are, that our civil liberties are being undermined by that. Well, what do you think our civil liberties are based on if it's not things like you can't just lock someone up and throw away the key just because of their beliefs? There has to be a present danger. You have to be able to estimate that. You have to be able to judge it. This is incredibly important. If you believe in civil liberties, then you believe that the government cannot put people in jail for what they believe, just because of a risk that you think that they pose. If you allow them to do that...
If they believe detonating a suicide bomb on a tube, if they believe in detonating a suicide bomb on the tube in order to go to paradise, I'm actually will lose no sleep, Richard, in locking them away and throwing them the key. Joseph, Joe, to be fair, Richard, we've got to go.
There are shades of de-radicalisation, of radicalisation for a start. So there are some people who are overtly violent, and those are the sorts of people who are, of course, most dangerous, and we have to monitor very carefully. I think you hit the nail on the head in that you said that it's very difficult to tell, but sometimes we can tell. So with Stratton, he was making violent threats in the days before he was released, and he was still released, and then he went over to stab people. How did that happen? That's a massive failure. There are other examples, like, for example, Usman Khan with the London Bridge, the fishmongers hall attack, where he seemingly had rehabilitated. And there was a sense of security that people had around him. He was attending a session as part of his program on release, and then he went and committed an attack. So it's actually very difficult once you get to that stage to try and de-radicalize people. I think actually really where we need to focus is on preventing radicalization in the first place. So particularly when it comes to online forums, social media, there are people who, on the face of it, might seem relatively normal, but they retreat to their bedroom, they spend most of their time online, they're seeing all sorts of horrible content, and they become radicalized. Some people can become de-radicalized. Some people work within their communities, whether it's far right or whether it's people in Muslim communities, and they work to try and prevent other people in their communities from becoming radicalized themselves. So it can happen, but we need to be very careful and judge on a case-by-case basis. And when people like the Stratton attacker are still overtly a threat, they are still making threats on the days before they're released, how do we have a system that allows them to go out and stab people?
And I do also want to make the point, by the way, I think it's worth noting that I have the same views. I know this often gets framed in terms of the jihadi debate, but frankly that's because it seems more prevalent in this country. But I do feel the same way about, I think if someone is a signed up member of some kind of Nazi organisation that has these far right views and those far right views turn murderous, I feel the same way about it. I don't feel like they can ever be de-radicalised either. It's not a one-way street as far as I'm concerned. But let's just move away from terror, really, and start going on to the climate agenda and whether or not actually Allegra Stratton, Boris Johnson's climate spokeswoman, is right to not practice what she's preaching in terms of getting an electric motor. Now, Joseph, I'm going to stay with you on this one. Do you think, actually, regardless of whatever your personal views may be on the climate crisis, actually, seriously, this is a ridiculous case of do as I say and not as I do, a la Matt Hancock, a la the G7, all of this stuff, right? She's riding around the country, razzing it across motorways in a diesel car. Meanwhile, the people of Birmingham have basically got to pay to go to work now.
Well, it's a bit ironic because she did sort of have a bit of a point in some of what she said, but of course she's somebody in government, so should be in a position to affect the change which we all need to see. To be fair to the government, they have recently committed to ensuring that all of their fleet of around 40,000 vehicles are electric by 2027. That's something that Bright Blue's called for. We're very happy about that. But The wider problem is that the market for electric vehicles in the UK is very nascent. We've fallen significantly behind our neighbours, including Norway, the Netherlands and Iceland. And there are kind of a few barriers that people tend to bring up when they talk about the fact they haven't got an electric vehicle yet. And those tend to be the fact that it's quite expensive. They're worried about charging infrastructure. She mentioned that, charging points in what she said. Range anxiety, if people are travelling long distances like she was talking about, and also just the general lack of choice. Now, there are a lot of things that the government should be doing right now in order to make it easier for people to take up electric vehicles. They need to be installing rapid charge points in petrol stations, front-loading grants that people can afford to buy the electric vehicles in the first place, and also things like increasing capital allowances for businesses to invest in electric vehicles. So there's lots of things that people can do, and it's very important because transport is such a massive part of our greenhouse emissions. It's about 28% in the UK, and more than half of that is cars.
Richard, just to come to you on this one now, I do wonder, when we had a guest from Extinction Rebellion on earlier, and I thought where he kind of let himself down a bit really was that it actually wasn't very long until he started talking about, the complete deconstruction of our current political system. And these things to me seem to be two separate issues, right? Cutting down on carbon, smashing capitalism. But all too often those two things get wedded together. And do you think that's where the eco lot let themselves down a bit?
Well, I mean, if people are going to be framing things in terms of smashing capitalism, then it's not going to appeal to a right-wing audience. I think you can be fairly confident of that. Look, Allegra Stratton, it doesn't matter what car she drives. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. She's a hypocrite. It doesn't matter. I don't care. I don't care about what she does with her dishes. It's all a complete load of nonsense, yeah? The thing that is so frustrating for me is that last week, we had Allegra Stratton saying, why don't you change what you do with your dishes in order to solve climate change? What that is that's blaming individuals for her government's failures, right? Like the way that we're going to solve the climate crisis is not by me turning the lights off more often. The way we're going to solve the climate crisis is by governments, for instance, imposing a carbon tax on corporations that are polluting enormous amounts, because that pollution is going to cost all of us an enormous amount of money in the future when we have to mitigate against climate change, when we have to deal with 300 million climate refugees, when we have to deal with the fact that the economy will be completely screwed by the climate crisis. Yeah, that's how you deal with it. Her government's refusing to do that, and therefore they're putting the blame on individuals by saying, oh, why don't you do this with your dishes?
I agree with that. I agree with a lot of that. If we are going to tackle if we accept that the climate crisis exists, which a lot of people don't, I've had a lot of callers in on this today, but let's just, for the sake of argument right now, let's just say it exists, right? Well, me turning the lights off, like you've just said there, me buying an electric car and all of this stuff, that's not going to have any bearing on it whatsoever. The cabal, and quite a small cabal, of massive corporations, right, who are funneling things into the ozone layer, they're the ones, aren't they, Joseph? I mean, they're the ones who, realistically, isn't it about time that people like us said, actually, you know what, I'm not going to change my boiler until you do something about that lot?
Well, I think the climate crisis definitely is real, for a start. But just moving on from that, I think it's really important that we build a public consensus here, because rightly people are concerned about the cost of changing their boilers, of getting new cars, and that's a genuine concern. A lot of that's because there's not a lot of information out there, but we need to build that public consensus. And so we did some work on carbon taxes, and we came up with the idea of you have a green dividend, so that people who, for example, are in lower incomes, who might disproportionately be impacted by the transition to greener technologies, greener ways of heating your home, etc., they don't lose out in terms of their pocket. And also making sure that we have a fair international system, so that we're not just importing lots of cheap goods from abroad, which are produced using carbon-intensive technologies, which then undermine our greener industries at home. So there are ways that we can do this to make it fairer, so that people who are on lower incomes and also British industries here at home do not suffer from this transition, because they don't have to. And we need to do this transition. The climate crisis is definitely real. Floods in China, floods in Germany, fires in Turkey, fires in Australia. It's all happening, and it's happening right now.
Well, it is happening right now. The argument is maybe it's always happened, but we'll have to wait and see about whether or not the Extinction Rebellion lot are right. Just in terms of moving away from that now, the reaction to Rishi Sunak's comments on working from home, which is that essentially if you want to get on, you need to be in the office. I think really alluding to the idea that you can schmooze and brown nose your boss, which some people are better at than others. Richard, where do you stand on this? Do you think that the office as we know it is dead? Is he right to be encouraging people to get back into work? Because I suspect really what he's saying as well is not just the idea of getting to work to get on, but there are local sandwich shops and coffee shops that are, and all this kind of places, right? That centre themselves around traditional workplace environments. That actually there's a wider economy out there that if we all got back to work as it was, then we know that might all kick on.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if the Conservative Party is funded by commercial property developers and landlords, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure it's just a coincidence.
Well, presumably they could turn their offices into housing, though, to be fair, mate. So I don't know if it's exactly just that.
That's not always a very easy thing to do, giving planning laws. But in any case, there are a lot of people who really stand to lose if people don't go back to their offices, and they're the people who bankroll Rishi Sunak. Look, Rishi Sunak is blaming young people for them not going into the office. I don't know which offices he works or worked in, but as far as I'm concerned, the reason whether people go back into their offices or not is down to their bosses. It's not what the most junior people in an office want to do that determines whether people go back from working from home or not. There is a reason that we have become dependent in our country and our economy. There's a reason we've become dependent on these incredibly informal ways of getting trained, having someone sit next to you who's doing the job a bit better and you learn from them. And that reason is that we've got an appallingly deregulated labour market. For 40 years, we've had more and more people working on contracts, working freelance, increasingly people working 0 hours. That means that no boss, or very few bosses, have got an interest in training up their most junior staff. There's literally no financial interest for them to do it. Therefore, productivity has stagnated. You're not going to get into a situation where you can train people up in an economy like that. Okay. It's going to get even worse if people are working from home.
All right, Joseph, just respond to that, please.
But I disagree with that. How does that training happen remotely? I mean, personally, I don't really care about Pret. Pret can go down for all I care. But I think the Chancellor is generally pretty bang on, which is that whilst I think it's important that we keep this flexibility, maybe working some of the days at home, some of the days in the office, working from home does have its limits. Being in the office is important for learning from your co-workers, learning from your managers. And by the way, managers need to come into the office. It's all well and good for managers to work from home because they have big houses, they're on bigger salaries. But they are the ones who need to be in the office with people who are below them in the hierarchy, making sure those younger people get a good chance to advance in their careers. And also the social aspect, you can't have a proper work social life via Zoom. A lot of people, when they're adults, they tend to meet new people via work. They can't really do that via Zoom.
Okay, good stuff, both of you. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it as ever. Richard Powell-Said, their former Labour advisor, and Joseph Silke, communications officer at Bright Blue, doing our bumper political punch-up. Thank you very much to both of you. Right, we come